The machines beeped in steady rhythm, each one a metronome counting down a life. Margaret sat there, motionless, as she had every day for the past 16 years, waiting, watching, nursing. It was the same chair, the same posture, the same hollowed eyes fixed on the man who used to be her whole world. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for Harold's. Cold, bonier than she remembered, but she held it anyway. There had been a time when Harold was the kind of man who filled every room he entered. His laugh made people smile even when they didn't want to. His voice carried the kind of calm only years of war and heartbreak could temper. He was her anchor in a chaotic world, her soft place to land. Now, his body lay like a vessel emptied of its captain. Stroke had robbed him of speech, of motion, of memory, but not of her love. 16 years of brushing his hair, feeding him spoonful by spoonful, turning him in bed so he wouldn't get sores, singing lullabies to a man who couldn't hear. Everyone called her saintly. She hated that word. Saints didn't cry in the shower. Saints didn't scream silently into pillows. Saints didn't wake up every morning wondering if today would be the day they'd be set free. She never left him. Not once. Not for a day. Not even an afternoon. Until the letter came. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, slid under her door like a whisper. At first, she thought it was another bill or one of the endless hospital statements. But when she opened it, her hands went cold. It was one sentence. Typed. He lied to you. Nothing else. No signature, no clue. She had stared at it for hours, the words haunting her like an echo. She didn't show it to anyone. Not her daughter Elise, not Pastor Jim, not the kind young nurse who called her Mrs. Marigold out of fondness. It became her secret and her undoing. In the days that followed, Margaret couldn't shake the words. She watched Harold differently, not with affection or duty but with suspicion. Lied about what? Their life was ordinary, wasn't it? Two school teachers who married young, raised a daughter, retired to a small town in Vermont. He got sick. She stayed. Simple, safe, steady, wasn't it? She began to look for signs. Little ones. She opened old boxes in the attic, dug through his desk drawers, reread the letters he'd written her during his army days, looked through photographs, frozen moments where his smile seemed, in retrospect, too perfect. And then she found it. Tucked behind an old tax file was a photograph she'd never seen before. It was Harold much younger, hair black, face vibrant, and in his arms was a baby. But the woman beside him wasn't Margaret. She was younger, prettier, and smiling. On the back, scrawled in Harold's handwriting, were 4 words. Me, Claire, and Jonah. Jonah? Margaret's heart stopped. They never had a son. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her legs threatening to give way. The world tilted. Her hands gripped the photo as though it might vanish, might rewrite itself if she blinked. Claire. Jonah. She whispered the names like prayers or curses, unsure which they were. She didn't sleep that night. The machines continued their monotonous beeping. Harold's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Morning came like betrayal. Margaret took the photo to the nurse's station. She asked for a phone book, an actual one, and flipped through the C's. There were 3 Claires in town. She called each one. 2 were strangers. The third paused before speaking. Who's asking? The woman's voice was cautious. This is Margaret Marigold, she said, her voice shaking. I believe you may have known my husband, Harold Marigold. A silence. Then, oh my God. Margaret's hand went numb. They agreed to meet. They sat at a diner on Maple Avenue. Margaret wore her best coat, hair brushed back, lipstick on. Claire was older now, maybe 70, with soft eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. The photo lay between them on the table. Claire touched it gently. He said he would tell you, Claire whispered. All those years ago. Tell me what? Margaret's voice cracked. Claire looked up. Her voice was a knife wrapped in velvet. That Jonah was his son. And mine. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret couldn't breathe. She stared at the woman across from her, this stranger who held a piece of her husband's past like it belonged to her. "You were together?" she asked, barely audible. "Before you," Claire said softly. "Long before. We were young. He was everything. But he got scared. When I got pregnant, he left. Said he'd come back once he was ready to be a father. But he never did." Margaret blinked back tears. "He was with me then." Claire nodded slowly. "He chose you. It should have felt like victory. It didn't." "Why now?" Margaret asked. "Why send the letter?" "I didn't," Claire said. "I thought he was gone. I had no idea he was still alive. Jonah was the one who found out. He's been looking for his father his whole life." Margaret felt her stomach twist. Jonah. Somewhere out there was a man full-grown, her husband's son. A man Harold never spoke of, never claimed, never once whispered about, even as she bathed him, fed him, held him through the darkest nights. A betrayal so complete, so intimate, it hollowed her from the inside. She stood up, leaving the photo on the table. Claire called after her. "I never wanted to hurt you." Margaret paused at the door, turned back. "You didn't," she said, voice cold. "He did." Back home, the air felt stale. Harold lay exactly as she'd left him, mouth slack, eyes closed. Margaret sat beside him again. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see her husband. She saw a stranger. She pulled out the photo, held it in front of his face. "You should have told me," she whispered. "All those years I thought I knew you." The machines kept beeping. "You let me carry all of this. Alone." A tear slid down her cheek. "I loved you more than I loved myself," she said. "I gave you everything, and you gave me half the truth." His eyes fluttered. For a second, just a second, she thought he heard her. She leaned closer. But his face was still, lifeless. She sat back. The photo trembled in her hand. Margaret knew this was the moment everything changed. Not because of the lie, but because now she had a choice. To stay, or to go. To forgive, or to become someone else. And for the first time in 16 years, she didn't know what she would do next. That night, the autumn wind rattled the old shutters of the house. Margaret sat awake, curled in her armchair, the photograph of Harold, Claire, and Jonah perched on her lap like a weight that refused to lift. She should have burned it. She should have let the past rot with the betrayal. But she didn't. Instead, she opened a fresh page in her old, dust-colored journal, the one she hadn't written in since Harold's stroke, and she began to write. Not poetry, not memories, not even questions. She wrote, "Who am I now?" The question sat at the top of the page, stark and sharp like broken glass. Beneath it, she listed everything she had been. Wife, mother, caretaker, teacher, believer, lover, forgiver. And now, broken. She closed the journal and placed it in the drawer. She didn't sleep. The next morning, she called her daughter. "Elise," she said, voice shaking. "Do you remember what your father was like before the stroke?" Elise laughed softly. "Of course I do. He was stubborn and funny and obsessed with oatmeal cookies." "What?" "No reason," Margaret lied. "I just needed to remember." They spoke briefly. Elise was always too busy, kids. Work, life, and Margaret never blamed her. She never asked her to come home. Never asked for help. That was the problem. She had carried too much for too long. After they hung up, Margaret stood before Harold's room for a long while. She didn't go in. Instead, she walked past it and into the basement, where the old army trunk lay under sheets and cobwebs. It hadn't been opened in decades. Inside were Harold's medals, his dog tags, old letters from war buddies, photographs yellowed with time. But then at the very bottom, something new. A folder. Inside, Margaret found hospital records, letters, and a birth certificate. Jonah Harold Fields. Born April 12, 1965. Mother, Claire Fields. Father, Harold Marigold. It was real. It wasn't just a photograph. It wasn't just a story. It was a life. And Harold had kept it from her deliberately, quietly, cowardly. She sat on the cold basement floor and wept. For Harold. For herself. For Jonah. For all the years that had been stolen by silence. She decided to find him. Not out of revenge. Not out of curiosity. But because something inside her needed to know who this man was, this echo of Harold. This living proof that her life had never been what she thought. She hired a private investigator, a man named Kent Delaney, who worked out of a narrow office next to the bakery on 4th Street. He didn't ask many questions, just took the name, the photo, and the birth certificate. "I'll call you in a week," he said. Margaret nodded. A week passed, then 10 days, then 14. When Kent finally called, his voice was brisk. "I found him," he said. Margaret's breath caught. "He's in Boston. Works in community housing development. No wife. 1 daughter. Lives in a modest place. Seems like a good guy." "A good guy?" She sat down slowly. "Does he know about me?" "He knows of you," Claire told him. "But I don't think he knows the full story." Margaret hesitated. "Can I meet him?" There was a pause. "I gave him your number. Told him it was your decision." That night, the phone rang. She stared at it for 5 full rings before picking up. "Hello." Her voice cracked. A pause. "Margaret." The voice was deep, warm, nervous. "Yes. This is Jonah." Silence. "I don't even know what to say," he said quietly. "Neither do I," Margaret whispered. They agreed to meet the following Saturday at the Arboretum in Boston. Margaret took the train alone. She hadn't traveled alone since she was a young woman. She watched the world blur past the window and wondered what she would see in Jonah's eyes. Harold? Herself? A stranger? She wore a pale blue coat and pinned her silver hair neatly back. In her purse, she kept the photo and the birth certificate. When she arrived, she spotted him instantly. He was taller than Harold, broader shoulders, but the eyes were unmistakable. The same stormy gray, the same intensity, the same sadness. He stood as she approached, unsure whether to hug or shake hands. In the end, he just said softly, "Hi." "Hi," she echoed. They sat on a bench under a ginkgo tree. The leaves had begun to fall, gold and brittle. "I don't know what you want to know," Jonah said. "I don't even know how to talk about this." "You don't have to," Margaret said gently. "We don't owe each other anything. Except maybe honesty." He looked at her. Really looked. "I always wondered what kind of woman my father would marry," he said. "Claire never said much. But she said you were devoted." Margaret looked away. "I was. Or I thought I was." "I don't blame you," he said. She turned to him. "I don't blame you either." They sat in silence. She handed him the photograph. "I found this a few weeks ago," she said. "It changed everything." He stared at it. "I've had the same copy since I was a boy," he said. "It's all I ever had of him." Margaret's chest ached. "He knew about you," she said. Jonah nodded. "He just didn't want to know me," he said. "Or maybe he was afraid." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish I could say that wasn't the man I knew. But maybe I never really knew him." Jonah smiled sadly. "Do you regret staying with him?" Margaret thought for a long time. "No," she said finally. "But I regret never asking more questions." He looked at her. "What do you want now?" She didn't know. A son? A friend? Closure? Maybe just a moment of truth. "I want to know you," she said. Jonah nodded slowly. "I'd like that." They sat together for another hour. Talked about books. About Elise. About Harold, the man both of them had loved and never truly known. Before they parted, Jonah asked gently, "Would you ever want to meet my daughter?" Margaret's eyes filled. "I would love that." When Margaret returned home, something had shifted. Harold was still alive, still silent, still broken. But so was she. Only now, she had begun to rebuild. She stood at the edge of his bed and looked at the man she had once given her whole life to. And for the first time, she spoke not as a wife or caretaker but as a woman who had finally seen the truth. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but I won't pretend anymore." She didn't stop caring for him. She just stopped letting him define her. Days passed. Jonah called every few evenings. Margaret found herself laughing again. She read books she'd once abandoned. Rejoined the book club she had quit a decade ago. Went to church not out of duty, but choice. And then, one morning, she received another letter. This one from Jonah's daughter. It was handwritten, looped in careful teenage cursive. Dear Margaret, my dad says you're amazing. I think you're brave. I don't remember my real grandmother, but I'd really like to get to know you if that's okay. Love, Lena. Margaret held the letter to her chest. For the first time in a very, very long time, she felt not just needed but wanted. Margaret folded Lena's letter carefully, placed it inside her journal, and stared out the kitchen window. Outside, 2 robins pecked at the frost-bitten grass, their feathers puffed against the crisp October chill. A sliver of warmth tugged at the corners of her mouth, a feeling unfamiliar but deeply welcome. That afternoon, she visited the florist for the first time in years. She chose yellow tulips, Harold's favorite, and brought them home. But instead of placing them in the vase beside his bed as she always did, she arranged them in the living room, in the light. She wanted beauty to return to the parts of the house where she lived, not just the corners shadowed by Harold's decline. She began to cook again, not just oatmeal and soup, but things with color and flavor: rosemary chicken, lemon rice, cherry tarts. For years, she'd cooked for survival. Now, she cooked because she wanted to remember the woman who once danced in the kitchen barefoot, a towel over one shoulder and a radio humming. She called Elise again, this time, not out of desperation or guilt, but to talk. Elise, she said, I want to tell you something. Something important. Her daughter's voice turned alert. Is Dad okay? He's the same, Margaret said. But I'm changing. There was a pause. What do you mean? And for the first time, Margaret told her everything. About the letter. About Claire. About Jonah. There was silence on the other end. I know it's a shock, Margaret whispered. It was for me, too. Elise didn't speak for a long while. When she did, her voice was soft. You should have told me sooner. But I'm glad you told me now. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. I didn't want to burden you, she said. You're not a burden, Mom. You never were. You just never let anyone help. Margaret bit her lip. Do you want to meet him? Jonah. Another pause. He's my brother. Isn't he? Margaret nodded, though Elise couldn't see. Yes, he is. Then yes, I want to meet him. They set a date. Jonah drove down the following week. He brought Lena with him. The meeting was quiet, careful, emotional. Lena hugged Margaret without hesitation, her youthful warmth melting some final layer of ice around Margaret's ribs. Elise and Jonah sat across from each other, exchanging stories of growing up with the same eyes, but different last names. Later that evening, after they'd all eaten Margaret's roast chicken and laughed over old family albums, Jonah stood at the doorway with tears in his eyes. I missed this, he said. I didn't even know I needed it. Margaret placed a hand on his cheek. Family finds its way back, even after years in the dark. That night, after everyone had gone, Margaret sat beside Harold once again. But something was different. She no longer came with empty hands and a bleeding heart. She came with the strength of having faced the truth and survived it. She leaned close. Your son is kind, she whispered. He's strong and smart and good. He deserved better than your silence. But he's made peace with it. So have I. Harold's eyes flickered beneath closed lids, as if in sleep or some deeper place. Margaret didn't expect a miracle. She'd stopped hoping for that long ago. She came not for Harold, but for herself. I'm going to live now, she said gently. Not just exist. She stood, kissed his forehead, and left the room. The weeks that followed bloomed with life. Margaret began volunteering at the local library, reading to children on Saturday mornings. She rejoined the choir, her alto voice a little rough but filled with heart. She and Lena exchanged letters, sometimes silly, sometimes profound. Elise came to visit more often. The three of them, mother, daughter, and newfound son, shared meals, stories, and silences that no longer felt heavy. One afternoon, as snow began to fall, Margaret walked the wooded path behind her home. She hadn't walked that trail since before Harold's stroke. The trees were bare, their branches clawing the sky, but the air smelled of pine and something crisp, something hopeful. At the clearing, she stopped and looked up. Everything had changed. And yet, here she stood, still breathing, still moving forward. She sat on an old bench, one Harold had built decades ago, and opened her journal. This time, she wrote something new. I am more than what he left behind. She closed the book and let the wind carry the rest away. Spring arrived late that year. It crept in gently, brushing the last of the snow from the fields like a mother waking her child. Margaret found herself standing on her porch one morning, warm mug in hand, listening to the robins return. The quiet no longer haunted her. In fact, for the first time in years, it sounded like possibility. Jonah called every weekend now. Elise too. Lena sent drawings, childlike portraits of their strange, reassembled family. In one, Margaret stood between Elise and Jonah, a crooked heart above their heads. Harold was there too, lying on a bed, eyes closed, peaceful. Underneath, Lena had scrawled in crayon, "Love, even when it's hard." Margaret had pinned it to the fridge. There were still hard days. Some mornings, the ache of years lost threatened to drag her under. On others, guilt slipped through the cracks, guilt for having stayed, guilt for not asking, guilt for loving a man who had kept a part of himself walled away. But now she had people to talk to, people who listened. She met Jonah's ex-wife, a reserved woman named Valerie, during one visit to Boston. They sat in a quiet cafe while Lena went to an art class. He talks about you a lot, Valerie said. You've given him something he didn't even know he needed. Margaret sipped her tea, her eyes soft. He's given me that, too. That day, she bought a frame for Lena's drawing. One early April morning, Harold took a turn. It began with silence, not the usual stillness of his body, but something deeper. The nurses noticed it first. His eyes, normally fluttering faintly, now stayed fixed. His breathing changed shallower, less rhythmic. Margaret stood over him, calm. She didn't panic. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. What surprised her was not fear, but clarity. She called Elise. Then Jonah. She didn't cry. Not yet. The doctor said it could be hours, maybe a day. They made him comfortable. That evening, Margaret sat alone by his bedside. The machines still beeped softly, but she no longer clung to them like she once had. Her hand rested on Harold's, worn with time, the wedding band still a perfect circle. I used to believe we were perfect, she whispered. And then I thought we were broken. But maybe we were both. His face didn't move. I spent so long keeping you alive, she said, her voice cracking. I forgot how to live. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a letter. She had written it the day after she met Jonah for the first time. It had stayed folded in her journal ever since. She began to read. Harold, I loved you with a kind of faith I thought could survive anything. Even silence. Even sickness. Even betrayal. I gave you everything. But I didn't know everything about you. And that hurt. It still does. But now I understand something I didn't before. You were scared. You made mistakes. But you also gave me years of laughter, of touch, of partnership. That matters too. So here's what I need you to know. I forgive you. And I'm letting you go now. You don't have to stay for me. Not anymore. You can rest. With love. Margaret. She folded the letter and slipped it into his hand. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the cherry trees were beginning to bloom. That night, Harold died. Peacefully. No gasping, no final grasp for breath. Just a slow, fading exhale, as if the soul had finally found its way home. Margaret didn't weep. Not yet. She sat with him until the nurses came. She kissed his forehead, closed his eyes. Then she walked outside. The sun was just beginning to rise. She stood in the golden light, the cold air brushing her cheeks like a goodbye. Then she took one step forward, and another. The funeral was simple, just as Harold would have wanted. Military rites, folded flag, soft music. Jonah stood beside Elise as the eulogy was read. People cried. People smiled. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing navy blue, her eyes dry but not empty. Afterward, Jonah approached her quietly. "You okay?" he asked. Margaret gave a small smile. "I think I will be." They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Later that week, Elise and Jonah helped her go through Harold's things. They donated most of Ithis' old clothes, books, even his beloved fishing gear. Margaret kept a few items: the photograph of their wedding day, his teaching license, and the battered notebook where he used to jot down quotes from the books he read. In the back of the notebook was a scribbled note in his handwriting. "I hope she knows I loved her, even when I didn't know how to say it." Margaret closed the book and held it to her chest. She didn't cry. Not yet. Weeks passed, then months. Margaret took a trip by herself to Nova Scotia, where she and Harold had once dreamed of retiring. She stayed in a small cottage by the sea, walked along the cliffs, ate lobster rolls, listened to the gulls. She wrote letters to herself, to Harold, to the woman she used to be. She forgave that woman, too. When she returned, Jonah and Lena were waiting with flowers. "I want to show you something," Jonah said. He drove her to a new housing project on the edge of town, low-income apartments built with care and dignity. In the community garden stood a new bench. On it was a plaque, in memory of Harold Marigold, a teacher, a father, a man who gave second chances, even if he never knew it. Margaret sat down. Lena took her hand, and for the first time since Harold's passing, Margaret wept. Not from sorrow, from grace. One evening, Elise invited everyone to dinner: Margaret, Jonah, Lena, even Valerie. They ate lasagna, laughed about Lena's new braces, shared photos from old albums. Near the end of the night, Elise stood and raised a glass. "To unexpected families," she said, "and to the woman who held us all together." Everyone turned to Margaret. She shook her head, embarrassed, but her eyes sparkled. Later, alone in her room, Margaret opened her journal one last time. She wrote, "Grief doesn't end, but neither does love. And now I know I can hold both." She closed the book and set it beside the framed photo of her, Elise, Jonah, and Lena. Her family, her truth, her life, finally whole. The summer after Harold's death was a quiet one. Margaret, now 78, found herself waking earlier, listening to the world stretch itself into day. The once heavy silence of the house had softened into something gentle, and absence filled not with sorrow, but space. Space for books, for long walks, for slow breakfasts and second cups of coffee. Her grief didn't disappear, it simply settled, like mist lifting off a lake in the morning. Jonah came to visit often, sometimes with Lena, sometimes alone. They brought paintbrushes, planters, and news stories. Together, they turned Harold's old study into an art room for Lena, now 11, who was growing into a sharp, observant young girl with questions about everything and kindness in her bones. "Do you think Grandpa ever saw the ocean?" she asked one afternoon while painting sunflowers. Margaret looked out the window. "He did. Once. With me. Before you were born." "Was he happy then?" Margaret smiled. "I think he was trying to be." She didn't want to rewrite Harold. She didn't want to paint over his failures with nostalgia. What she did want was to give Lena a truth full of nuance. That people could be good and flawed, brave and selfish. That loving someone didn't require pretending they had never failed you. That was the lesson Margaret had taken longest to learn. In August, Elise brought up something unexpected. "I think you should tell your story," she said over lunch on the back porch. "My story?" Margaret laughed. "It's just an ordinary one." Elise tilted her head. "It's not. Mom, you carried Dad for 16 years. You raised me. And now you've made a new family from something that could have shattered you. That's not ordinary." Margaret waved it off. But the idea stuck. That night, she pulled out her old typewriter, the one Harold had gifted her on their first anniversary. It had been gathering dust in the corner of the guest room. She oiled it, replaced the ribbon, and fed in a fresh sheet of paper. She stared at the page for a long time before typing the first sentence. "I was a woman who believed love would be enough. until I learned that truth is what gives love its shape. Every day, she wrote. Sometimes just a paragraph. Sometimes 5 pages. She didn't censor herself. She wrote about the early days, how Harold made her laugh until her stomach hurt, how they built their first house from scratch, how he used to hum in the shower. Then she wrote about the silence, about the moment the letter slid under her door, about the anger, the betrayal, the breaking, and finally, about the rebuilding. She wrote with clarity, not cruelty, with honesty, not hate. Jonah read each chapter. So did Elise. Lena sat beside her during edits, offering commentary only a child could get away with. Maybe don't say aching soul so many times, she said, squinting at a paragraph. Margaret laughed. You're brutal. Lena grinned. You're welcome. In October, Margaret self-published her book. She titled it, What Remains? A Life After the Silence. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few friends would read it, a handful of curious neighbors. But something surprising happened. Elise shared it online. So did Jonah. A friend of a friend, an editor from a mid-sized publishing house, read it and asked to republish it nationwide. Within 2 months, Margaret was invited to speak at a small literary festival in New Hampshire. She wore a navy blue dress and carried her journal in her purse like a talisman. The audience was mostly women her age, a few younger ones scattered in. She took the podium, hands trembling, voice low at first. I'm not here to tell you how to survive heartbreak, she began. I'm here to say that when it happens, and it will, you get to decide what comes next. And sometimes, if you're lucky, what comes next is more honest than what came before. Afterward, people waited in line to speak to her. Some brought books to sign. Others brought stories. One woman said, I stayed for 40 years with a man who never really saw me. Your words made me feel less alone. Another whispered, You helped me forgive someone I thought I never could. That night, alone in her hotel room, Margaret looked at her reflection. She looked tired, but strong. There was grace in her face now, carved from years of waiting and discovery. She whispered to the mirror, You did good. And for once, she believed it. In December, Jonah invited Margaret to join them for Christmas in Boston. You'll stay the week, he insisted. Lena already cleared space on her bookshelf for your next novel. Margaret laughed, but agreed. On Christmas Eve, the house was warm with laughter. Valerie came, bringing spice cider. Elise arrived the next morning, surprising everyone with cinnamon rolls and matching pajamas. The dining room table was full of roasted vegetables, turkey, and pie. Margaret sat at the head of the table, eyes wide with gratitude. Lena, wearing reindeer antlers, stood and tapped a glass. I have a toast, she announced, to Grandma Margaret, for being the bravest, coolest, kindest woman I know. Everyone clapped. Margaret blushed, blinking back tears. Jonah leaned in. You deserve this. She nodded. I know. It wasn't pride. It was peace. After the new year, Margaret began volunteering at a local shelter, teaching writing classes to women in transition, divorced, widowed, recovering. She didn't preach. She listened. Some wrote about their children, others about abuse. One woman wrote a single line over and over. He said he loved me. He said he loved me. Margaret sat beside her, gently placed a hand over hers. Maybe now, she said, you can start writing what you say. By spring, that woman had written 20 pages. One day in April, Margaret walked the Arboretum trail where she'd met Jonah the first time. The trees were blooming again just like that day. She found the same bench, sat quietly, closed her eyes. The wind stirred the branches. She heard laughter in the distance. And she smiled. In her purse was a second letter. Not to Harold, but to herself. Dear Margaret, you stayed when it was hard. You forgave when it was unthinkable. And then you chose yourself. You did not break. You bloomed. I'm proud of you. With love. Me. She folded it, placed it in her journal. And for the first time in a long, full life, Margaret stood not as a wife, or widow, or mother, but as herself. Whole. Seen. Loved.